Officer Derek Thompson stared in disbelief as he looked at the woman standing in front of him. She was calm, composed, and with a sharp look of authority in her eyes. Her uniform gleamed in the afternoon sun, but what really hit him like a punch to the gut was the badge she wore. It was the same badge he had just been proudly given less than a year ago, the badge of captain. Captain? Derek stammered, his heart racing. The woman, tall and poised, nodded slowly. Yes, Derek. Captain Erica Johnson. And I think we need to have a long conversation about this little stop of yours. His jaw dropped. He was sure his face had gone pale. Wait, what? He blinked a few times, still not comprehending what was happening. The woman who, just a few moments ago, had been the one he was pulling over for a routine traffic stop was the new captain of his precinct. The same captain he had heard whispers about for months, rumors about her breaking barriers and how she was determined to take down anyone who stood in the way of justice. The same captain he had been dreading ever since his transfer to this department. Derek didn't even know how he had gotten here. One moment, he was just doing his job, stopping a black woman in a sleek car for speeding, just like any other day. But now, he was standing frozen in place, his body trembling, his throat dry, and his mind racing. The woman didn't seem to be in a hurry to speak. She stood still, arms crossed, as if she was waiting for him to say something. But what could he possibly say? Do you have anything to say for yourself, Officer Thompson? Her voice was calm, yet there was a sharpness to it that sent a chill down his spine. Derek swallowed hard. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, but his pride and stubbornness fought to keep his composure. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He had been reckless, no doubt about that. It wasn't his first time pulling over a black driver, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the woman's eyes glinted, or maybe it was because of the rumors he had heard about her leadership. Or maybe it was because she had just seen right through his weak attempt at intimidation. Captain Johnson, Derek began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. He realized he had no excuse for what he had done. Nothing he could say would make this right. Captain Johnson stepped forward, her heels clicking on the pavement with each step. You pulled me over because you thought I was speeding, didn't you? She didn't wait for him to answer. But you didn't even bother to check my registration, did you? Derek felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had made assumptions, and now he was paying the price. I should have, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. You should have, Captain Johnson replied, her tone soft but firm. But you didn't. You just assumed because I was a black woman in a nice car, that I was up to no good. You thought you could get away with treating me like any other suspect. Derek's heart was pounding. He knew she was right. He had let his biases take control, and now he was standing face to face with the consequences. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling like lead in his mouth. I messed up. That's an understatement, she said, shaking her head. I'm not here to lecture you, Derek. But I will tell you this, you need to understand that people like you can't keep acting this way and expect to get away with it. Not anymore. The air between them was thick with tension, and for a moment, Derek wondered if this was it. If this was the end of his career. But just as he thought things couldn't get worse, Captain Johnson dropped the bombshell that made his blood run cold. I'm your new captain, Derek, she said, the words hanging heavy in the air. I'm the one who gets to decide your fate now. And trust me, I don't take this kind of behavior lightly. Derek froze, his mind reeling. He had heard rumors about her, of course. He had heard she was tough, that she was relentless. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing her in this moment. You're the captain, he asked, his voice shaky. Captain Johnson nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. That's right. And I suggest you think long and hard about the choices you make from here on out. Because the next time you decide to pull someone over based on assumptions, I will be the one holding you accountable. Derek felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders like a heavy boulder. He didn't know how to respond. What could he possibly say to someone who held his entire future in their hands? For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of traffic passing by, as if the world had paused to watch this confrontation unfold. Captain Johnson stepped back, breaking the silence. I'll let you off with a warning this time. But don't think for a second that this is over. She turned to walk away, but not before pausing to add one final remark. Think about your actions, Officer Thompson. Because they will have consequences. And next time, I won't be so lenient. As she walked back to her car, Derek stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. He had messed up, and he had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain, the game had changed, and he was about to find out just how far Captain Johnson was willing to go to make sure justice was served. Earlier that day, Derek had woken up like any other officer, ready to patrol the streets of the city. His morning had started with the usual routine: coffee, breakfast, and a quick glance at his phone to check for any updates. But he had no idea that his day would take a turn that would change his life forever. Derek had been a cop for 6 years. He had seen his fair share of traffic stops, arrests, and tense situations. But today felt different. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had heard the rumors about the new captain, Erica Johnson. A woman. A black woman. And not just any woman, a woman who had worked her way to the top, defying every expectation and overcoming every obstacle that had been put in her path. There were whispers among the precinct about her no-nonsense attitude, about how she was determined to root out corruption and bring change to a system that had long been broken. Some of the officers respected her. Others were terrified of her. But Derek? He didn't know what to think. He had never met her, never even seen her in person. But he had heard enough stories to know that she was someone who didn't tolerate disrespect. And now, here she was, standing right in front of him. He had been driving down the street when he spotted her car speeding by. Without thinking, he flipped on his lights and pulled her over, assuming it was just another routine stop. He had no idea who she was. To him, she was just another driver. But now, everything had changed. Derek felt his stomach turn as he replayed the events in his mind. He had made assumptions, and now he had to face the consequences. Would his career be over before it had even really started? As Captain Johnson disappeared into the distance, Derek stood there, staring at the spot where she had been. What was going to happen next? What would she do now that she knew who he was? Only time would tell. The next few days dragged by for Officer Derek Thompson. The encounter with Captain Erica Johnson weighed heavily on his mind, but every time he tried to shake it off, it came rushing back, like a heavy fog, suffocating and impossible to ignore. Derek couldn't stop replaying that moment, her eyes locked on his, calm and commanding. "I'm your new captain," she had said, and her words had settled into his chest like a stone. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the parking lot. What would happen now? What would she do? Was this the beginning of the end for him? He showed up for his shifts, did the usual rounds, but he was different. His colleagues noticed it. "Hey Derek, you all right?" asked Officer James Patel, one of his fellow patrolmen, during a coffee break. Derek gave him a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, just tired." "You sure? You've been a little off lately." "I'm fine," Derek replied quickly, not wanting to talk about it. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain what had happened with Captain Johnson. How could he? He didn't even understand it himself. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine calls, mundane traffic stops, and the usual patrol. But Derek couldn't escape the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, the fear that Captain Johnson was watching him, waiting for him to slip up again. That evening, when he got home, he poured himself a drink. It was the only thing that helped calm his nerves, but even then, it didn't feel like enough. The next morning, as he arrived at the precinct, there was an unsettling sense of tension in the air. Derek couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something felt off. He was just about to clock in when Sergeant Williams, a gruff man with years of experience, stopped him in the hallway. "Thompson," he said, his voice low. "The captain wants to see you in her office." Derek's heart skipped a beat. His palms began to sweat. He tried to keep his face neutral, but his mind raced. Was this it? Was this the moment he'd been dreading since that fateful day? "Thanks, Sergeant," Derek muttered, walking toward the office with heavy steps. The precinct had a strange quietness today, as if everyone knew something he didn't. As he approached Captain Johnson's office, he could feel his heart beating faster in his chest. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in." Derek pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was tidy and minimalistic, a sharp contrast to the chaos he often felt out on the streets. Behind the desk sat Captain Johnson, her eyes locked on her computer screen. She didn't look up when he entered, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft click of her keyboard. "Have a seat, Officer Thompson," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was as controlled as ever, but there was something colder about it now. Derek hesitated, then took a seat in the chair across from her desk. He tried not to let his anxiety show, but he knew she could probably feel it in the air. Captain Johnson leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Derek's stomach churn. He opened his mouth, but closed it again. What could he say? Should he apologize again? Was that enough? "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice betraying his nerves. "I'll make it clear then," she said, her tone growing colder. "You and I both know what happened that day. You made a mistake, Derek. A big one. And while I'm willing to overlook it for now, I need you to understand something very clearly." Her gaze never wavered as she leaned forward. "You've been given a second chance, but that doesn't mean I'll be lenient forever. The department has rules. I have rules. And you will follow them. No more assumptions, no more shortcuts. You will treat everyone, with the respect they deserve." Derek nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm going to be watching you closely, Officer Thompson. I expect you to do your job with integrity, and if I see another hint of what happened last time, there will be consequences." Her eyes locked onto his, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. He felt a lump form in his throat. "Yes, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Captain Johnson gave him a sharp nod. "Good. Now, get back to work." As Derek left her office, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. On one hand, he had avoided immediate punishment. On the other hand, Captain Johnson had made it clear that this was far from over. Every move he made from now on would be under her scrutiny, and if he slipped up, there would be no mercy. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Derek went through the motions of his patrol, responding to calls, and checking in with his team. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that Captain Johnson was always watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He knew he couldn't afford another one. Around midday, as he was driving through one of the quieter neighborhoods, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we have a 10 to 29 in progress. Possible robbery at the convenience store on 5th and Pine. Proceed with caution." Derek immediately flicked on his lights and turned onto the street, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the kind of call that could change everything. He had to prove himself. When he arrived at the scene, he saw a group of officers already outside the convenience store, their guns drawn. The store's front window was shattered, and glass was scattered on the ground. The sound of sirens filled the air as Derek parked his cruiser and approached the officers. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with adrenaline. "We've got 2 suspects inside," Officer Patel replied. "They're armed and barricaded in the back room. We're waiting for backup." Derek's heart raced as he scanned the area. The situation was tense. It was just another routine call gone wrong, but something felt different this time. The air was thick with anticipation. Before he could speak again, a voice crackled over the radio. "Unit 47, backup is en route. Proceed with caution and hold your position until further orders." But before Derek could respond, there was a loud bang from inside the store. His body stiffened, and instinct took over. He grabbed his radio. "Shots fired. Officer down." The sudden urgency in his voice felt like a punch to the gut. His training kicked in, and he rushed to take cover behind a nearby car, waiting for backup to arrive. The tension was unbearable, every second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the shooting stopped. Silence fell over the street, and Derek's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What had just happened inside? And were they going to make it out of this alive? The answer was still unclear, but Derek knew one thing for sure: he had to prove himself. The weight of Captain Johnson's words loomed over him like a shadow, and if he didn't make the right choices now, the consequences could be more than just career-ending. They could be life-altering. And as he crouched behind the car, waiting for the next move, Derek couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for this? What would Captain Johnson think of him now? The extreme event of the day had just begun, and Derek's future, his life, hung in the balance. The silence that followed the gunshots felt like an eternity. Derek crouched behind the patrol car, his heart hammering in his chest. Sweat trickled down his brow as he listened for any sounds of movement from inside the convenience store. The officers around him were just as tense, waiting for the backup to arrive, their hands tight on their weapons. "Stay low," Officer Patel whispered, his voice low but urgent. Derek nodded, but his mind was racing. He had been in tense situations before, traffic stops that had gone sideways, confrontations with suspects that had escalated. But this was different. The feeling in the air was thick with uncertainty, and every second that passed felt like a countdown to something far worse. Then suddenly, the front door of the store burst open, and 2 officers rushed out, dragging a third between them. It was Officer Harass, one of their newer recruits. He was pale, his uniform soaked with blood, his eyes wide with panic. "Get him to the ambulance," Patel shouted, rushing forward to help them. Derek's stomach churned as he saw the bullet wounds on Harris's chest and arm. "Officer down," Derek murmured under his breath, his throat tight. The chaotic scene seemed to be unfolding in slow motion. More officers arrived, their sirens blaring, the air filled with the scent of smoke and the tang of fear. The backup that had been promised was finally here, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Patel and 2 other officers helped Harass into the ambulance, but Derek couldn't tear his eyes away from the store. The door had closed again, and the situation inside was still unknown. What had happened? Who were they up against? And why did it feel like things were spiraling out of control? "Thompson, stay focused," Sergeant Williams called, pulling him back from his thoughts. "We're going in. Get your gear ready." Derek nodded quickly, trying to push his rising panic aside. His hands shook as he strapped on his bulletproof vest. His mind raced with 100 different scenarios, most of them ending badly. He checked his weapon, a steadying motion that, for a brief moment, helped him clear his head. There was no time for hesitation. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was real. Lives were on the line, including his own. The officers gathered around Sergeant Williams, forming a line. "We go in together," Williams ordered, his voice gruff but steady. "Stay sharp. No heroes. We're going in slow, and we're going in clean." Derek felt the weight of those words. They were heading into a potentially dangerous situation, and one wrong move could get them all killed. His mind flashed back to that moment with Captain Johnson. The pressure she had put on him to do his job correctly, without letting his personal biases or mistakes get in the way, was intense. But now, it wasn't just about following orders. It was about survival. The team slowly advanced toward the store, their footsteps muffled on the pavement. The street was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Derek felt the sweat on his palms, his heartbeat thumping in his ears. As they reached the door, Sergeant Williams signaled for the team to stop. "On my count," he whispered, glancing back at them. 3, 2, 1. He kicked the door open, and the officers rushed in. The inside of the store was a mess. The shelves were knocked over, and broken glass littered the floor. Derek's eyes immediately scanned the area, searching for movement, for any sign of the suspects. The smell of gunpowder was heavy in the air. A few aisles down, Derek could see 2 figures crouching behind a display of snacks, weapons in hand. "Drop your weapons," Derek shouted, his voice carrying through the store. His heart raced as the 2 suspects turned to face them, their eyes wide with panic. One was a man tall and wiry, his face covered by a bandana. The other, a woman, was shorter, but she held herself just as defiantly. Both of them hesitated for a split second, but that was all it took. One of them raised their weapon, a small handgun, and fired. Derek's instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the shot, his body slamming against a shelf. His heart skipped a beat as the world seemed to slow down. He could hear the sound of gunfire in the background, the exchange of shots, the shouts of his fellow officers as they returned fire. The man and woman behind the display moved fast, ducking for cover, but Derek wasn't about to let them get away. He steadied himself, aiming his weapon at the man who was now standing in the aisle, still firing. "Freeze!" Derek shouted, his voice sharp. The man hesitated, glancing at the woman next to him. "Don't do it," the woman yelled, but it was too late. Derek fired, the shot landing squarely in the man's shoulder. He dropped his weapon immediately, clutching his arm and falling to the ground. "Got him!" Derek shouted. The tension was broken, but not for long. The woman lunged forward, desperate, and aimed her gun at Derek. But before she could pull the trigger, Sergeant Williams was there. He tackled her to the ground with a force that made Derek's stomach turn. The woman screamed, but it was over. They had her. The store was silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that followed a battle, a hard-won victory. Derek breathed heavily, trying to calm the adrenaline rushing through his veins. His body was shaking, his hands still clutching his weapon. He glanced at the man on the floor, now handcuffed and groaning in pain. And then he turned to the woman, who was also cuffed, her face twisted with anger. "You okay, Thompson?" Sergeant Williams asked, walking up to him. Derek nodded, still trying to collect himself. "Yeah, I'm fine. We got them," Williams said, giving him a quick pat on the shoulder. "Good work." Derek didn't feel like celebrating. He just wanted to sit down, to take a deep breath and let the world stop spinning. His head was still pounding, and his heart felt like it was about to burst. But as the rest of the team processed the scene and made the arrests, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He thought about the events of the day, everything that had led him to this point. The encounter with Captain Johnson. The warning she had given him. The pressure she had placed on his shoulders. And now this. Had he proven himself? Had he done enough to redeem his mistake from that traffic stop? Or was this just the beginning of something far bigger than he had realized? Before Derek could find an answer, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Officer Thompson," Sergeant Williams called, waving him over. "The captain wants a word with you." Derek's stomach dropped. He didn't need to ask which captain. He knew it was Erica Johnson. And he knew that whatever conversation was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as he walked toward the captain. The events of the day had been a whirlwind, but now, standing in front of her again, Derek knew that the real test had just begun. Would she see this as enough? Or would the shadow of that moment in the parking lot still haunt him? As he reached Captain Johnson, she gave him a quick nod. "Good job today, Thompson," she said, her voice calm, but there was a hint of something else in her eyes, something hard. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Derek swallowed, his mind racing. "What do you mean, Captain?" Her eyes met his, sharp and unwavering. "I've been watching you," she said quietly, her gaze piercing. "And you have a lot to prove. Don't think for a second that this changes everything." Derek felt his heart sink. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. And as he looked back at the store, at the suspects they had apprehended, he knew one thing for sure. The real challenge was just beginning. The air was thick with tension as Derek stood at the crossroads of his career. What would Captain Johnson do next? What would he do? Derek stood before Captain Johnson, her words still ringing in his ears. The tension in the air was palpable, and every inch of him screamed to either apologize again or make some kind of excuse, but he knew better. The captain wasn't the type to entertain weak apologies. She wanted results. She wanted a professional, a man who could rise to the occasion without any hand-holding. But how could he prove that to her? What more could he do after everything he'd been through? His mind raced as Captain Johnson studied him, her gaze unwavering. It felt like she could see straight through him, past the surface, straight into his deepest doubts. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. "You're not off the hook, Thompson," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "You did well today, but this doesn't erase what happened last time. That's still in the back of my mind. I want to see consistency." Derek nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to respond, but he wasn't sure what to say. What could he say to a woman who had just seen right through him, who was calling him out for what he was, an officer who had let personal biases cloud his judgment? "I understand, ma'am," Derek said, his voice quiet but resolute. Captain Johnson regarded him for a moment longer before nodding. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Thompson." This was a step in the right direction, but one good call doesn't make a career. She turned on her heel, heading toward the precinct door, but stopped just before she reached it. "Get to work. You're not done yet." As she left, Derek felt the weight of her words settle heavily on him. He had made it through this round, but he knew that his battle was far from over. The feeling that Captain Johnson was always watching him, waiting for him to slip up again, was becoming an oppressive cloud in his mind. He took a long breath, trying to shake off the anxiety, but it lingered. He turned back to the precinct, where officers were still processing the scene, and the usual hum of activity began to return. The adrenaline from the robbery call was fading, replaced by the monotonous routine of a normal day. But for Derek, nothing about today felt normal. As he moved toward his desk to file the reports, Derek couldn't help but replay the events of the day over and over again. The way he had dived for cover, the gunfire, the rush of securing the suspects. And even though everything had turned out fine, at least for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to focus on the reports. That's what he needed to do now, just get through the paperwork, file the necessary reports, and keep his head down. No more mistakes. But the moment his pen hit the paper, it all started to unravel again. The words from Captain Johnson echoed in his mind. One good call doesn't make a career. How could he prove he wasn't a liability? How could he show that he wasn't just some officer caught up in the rush of the moment, constantly making mistakes and never learning from them? Thompson. Derek looked up sharply at the voice. It was Officer Patel, his colleague from the earlier call. Patel had a serious look on his face, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something darker. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Patel asked, his voice low. Derek set his pen down and nodded. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but he knew Patel wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. The two of them stepped into a small meeting room just off the main office, and Patel shut the door behind them. Derek raised an eyebrow, unsure of what was coming. "What's going on?" Derek asked, crossing his arms. Patel exhaled slowly before speaking. "I heard about what happened with you and Captain Johnson. About the traffic stop. And everything that followed." Derek felt his stomach tighten. "What about it?" Patel gave him a serious look. "You know, word travels fast around here. Everyone's talking about it, man." Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I figured. But I've done everything I can to fix it. I've apologized. I've worked my hardest. What else can I do?" Patel paused, clearly thinking before he spoke. "Look, I'm not here to give you a lecture. But you need to know that Captain Johnson is not an easy person to please. I know her from before. She doesn't give second chances unless she sees real change. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about." Derek raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Patel leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "I've seen the way you work, Derek. You've got the skills, you've got the potential. But you're also carrying a lot of baggage. Everyone here knows you're a good officer, but you've got to prove it. You've got to show that you can put the past behind you. And that's not just about following orders. It's about acting different. Changing your mindset." Derek took a deep breath, letting Patel's words sink in. He had tried to convince himself that everything would work out, that one big bust would erase his past mistakes. But now Patel was telling him something different, that he needed to work harder, change more, be better. But was that enough? "How do I do that?" Derek asked quietly. Patel shrugged slightly. "You have to prove you can handle pressure. You have to show that you're willing to be the officer everyone can rely on, no matter what. I'm just saying, don't let the captain's watchful eye get to you. It's not just about what you do in the field, it's about your mindset, your attitude. If you let her see that you're truly committed to this job, she'll respect you for it." Derek felt a small sense of clarity in Patel's words, but it didn't last long. He knew he had his work cut out for him. As he stepped out of the meeting room, a wave of anxiety washed over him again. He didn't just have to do his job well, he had to prove that he was capable of being the officer Captain Johnson needed. It wasn't just about his past mistakes anymore. It was about shaping his future. Later that afternoon, Derek received another call, a domestic dispute in a residential area just outside of town. It wasn't anything unusual. These types of calls came in all the time. But as Derek drove to the scene, a strange feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. This was his chance. A low-level call, sure, but it was still a chance to prove something, to himself, to the captain, to everyone. He arrived at the scene, and a tense silence greeted him. Two officers were already standing outside the house, talking to a woman who was visibly upset. Derek stepped out of the car and approached them. "What's the situation?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and neutral. "Arguing inside," Officer Lee said, glancing toward the front door. "We need backup, but it's pretty quiet right now. Could be just a yelling match." Derek nodded, and without another word, he stepped inside. As he entered, the atmosphere inside the home felt different, thick with tension, but not immediately violent. A couple in their 40s stood near the living room, both red-faced and shouting at each other. "Everything okay here?" Derek asked, trying to defuse the situation. He raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. The woman, mid-40s, with a disheveled appearance, turned to him, her eyes filled with frustration. "He's been drinking, officer. He doesn't listen to me. He never does." The man, slurring his words, glanced at Derek but barely registered his presence. "She's always on my case," he muttered, swaying slightly. Derek nodded and looked between them. It didn't seem like anything would escalate to violence, but the tension was thick. His instincts told him that this could go wrong fast if he wasn't careful. This was his chance to stay calm, to handle it the right way. He couldn't let Captain Johnson's scrutiny hang over him anymore. The man suddenly raised his hand, a gesture that immediately sent a chill down Derek's spine. His training kicked in. "Stop!" Derek commanded firmly, his hand moving to his holster. The man froze, his eyes wide. Just calm down," Derek said, his voice steady but commanding. He kept his eyes locked on the man, every muscle in his body tense. The tension in the room was electric, but Derek held his ground. The standoff lasted for a long second, long enough for Derek to feel the weight of every choice he had made in the past few months. This was it. This was his moment. And then the man slowly lowered his hand. "All right," the man grumbled, sitting down heavily on the couch. Derek exhaled in relief. Another call handled, another crisis averted. But this wasn't just about the situation. It was about proving to himself that he could stay in control, that he could do this, even with the weight of his past mistakes dragging him down. As he stood there, glancing over at Officer Lee, who had watched the entire interaction, he felt the smallest flicker of something inside him. Could he really change? Could he prove himself to Captain Johnson and everyone else? The next call might not be so. The relief from the domestic dispute call was short-lived. As Derek stood in the living room of that quiet suburban home, trying to calm himself, he couldn't shake the pressure building up in his chest. It was like a weight that wouldn't go away, a constant reminder that he was being judged at every turn, that his next move was going to make or break him. He watched Officer Lee nod approvingly, but something in Derek's gut told him that one small slip-up would ruin it all. That lingering doubt in the back of his mind wouldn't let him breathe easy, not yet. Captain Johnson had seen through his facade. She'd seen the officer who had faltered once, and there was nothing he could do to erase that. As he left the house, the sunlight felt colder, the air thinner. The world seemed to be waiting for him to trip, to make a mistake. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he did his best to push it away. "Nice job in there, Thompson," Officer Lee said, clapping him on the back. "You handled that well." "Thanks," Derek replied, trying to keep his tone even. He wasn't sure if Lee was just being polite, or if he actually believed it. Either way, he couldn't afford to get complacent. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, the kind of quiet that let Derek's thoughts spiral. Every small detail of the day replayed in his head. What if he had handled the situation wrong? What if Captain Johnson had seen him stumble again? He knew he had to keep pushing forward. But the fear of failure, of letting everyone down again, was starting to sink its teeth into him. Later that evening, the precinct buzzed with a normal post-shift chatter. Officers were talking about their days, comparing stories of bizarre calls or crazy arrests. Derek did his best to blend in, pretending to laugh at the jokes, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't care about the gossip. All he cared about was how Captain Johnson would view him next time. Would he get another chance to prove himself, or was this the end of the road? As he sat at his desk, filling out more paperwork, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Officer Patel again. "Hey Thompson," Patel said, leaning in. "I just heard they're going to be reassigning some officers soon." Derek's stomach dropped. Reassignments? That could mean anything. The possibility of being transferred to a less desirable position was never far from a cop's mind. If he got reassigned, it would be a huge step backward. It could even be the end of his career in this precinct. Reassigning? Derek asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Yeah," Patel replied, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "There's talk of moving some of us into different teams. You know, shake things up a bit. Maybe some detectives or a different squad. It's not official yet, but it's coming." Derek's heart pounded in his chest. Being reassigned to a different unit could be a fresh start, but it also meant that Captain Johnson might be losing faith in him. If she thought he wasn't up to the challenge, she would move him out. Was that what was happening now? Would he be one of the officers she dropped from the regular patrol? Before he could say anything, Patel gave him a half-smile and added, "Just keep doing your thing. You've been improving, right? I mean, that last call was solid. You've got this. Derek nodded, but inside, he felt like the ground was slipping beneath him. What was improving, really? Was it enough to prove that he was capable, or was it just a temporary fix for deeper issues? Thanks, Derek said quietly. I'll keep that in mind. As the shift drew to a close, Derek couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. He packed up his things slowly, his mind clouded with the fear of the unknown. The precinct was beginning to clear out as officers headed home for the night, but Derek couldn't leave just yet. Something was still nagging at him, and he knew he had to figure it out before it consumed him. Just as he was about to grab his coat and leave, the door to the captain's office opened. There, standing in the doorway, was Captain Erica Johnson. "Thompson," she said, her voice steady. "Get in here." Derek's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been dreading and, at the same time, had been waiting for. He straightened his posture and walked toward her office, his mind racing with what was to come. As he entered, Captain Johnson was sitting behind her desk, reviewing some paperwork. But as soon as he stepped in, she looked up, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Close the door," she ordered. Derek did as instructed, his hand slightly trembling as he clicked the door shut. There was no avoiding it now. Whatever was coming next, he had to face it head-on. "Sit down," Captain Johnson said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Derek sat, his body tense. He could feel the weight of her gaze even before she spoke. "You've done well lately, Thompson," she said, surprising him. "I've been watching your progress." Derek's mind raced. Watching my progress? Did that mean? But, Captain Johnson continued, cutting through his thoughts. "I still don't see enough." Not yet. Derek's heart sank. He had hoped, prayed even, that maybe, just maybe, she would see that he was finally getting his act together. But apparently, it wasn't enough. "How much more do I need to prove, Captain?" Derek asked, his voice tight. "What do you want from me?" Captain Johnson leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "You're a good officer, Thompson. You know that. But good is not enough. Not in this job. I need to see someone who can handle the pressure day in and day out. Someone who doesn't buckle when things get tough. Someone who's consistent." Derek swallowed, trying to stay composed. "I've been working hard. I've been trying to make things right." "You've been trying," Captain Johnson agreed, "but trying is not the same as doing. You've shown some improvement, but I need to see more. I need to see you take control, not just of the situations, but of yourself." Derek stared at her, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. "I will. I'll keep proving it." Captain Johnson gave a slow nod. "I'm giving you one last chance, Thompson. You're not out of the woods yet. But you're on a short leash." Derek's mind was spinning. One last chance? He had to make it count. Captain Johnson stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Get to work. Prove to me that you deserve to stay in this precinct." Derek nodded, standing up as well, though his legs felt like they were made of lead. He turned and walked out of her office, but as he closed the door behind him, a knot formed in his stomach. One last chance. As Derek walked back to his desk, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He had expected a reprimand, maybe even an ultimatum. But this? This was worse. One last chance meant everything. If he failed again, there would be no coming back. He had to do everything right. No more mistakes. The weight of Captain Johnson's words hung heavy in his chest as he sat down at his desk. There was no more room for error. No more second chances. Derek took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to fail now. Not after everything. Not after all the work he had put in. As the evening settled in, Derek looked out the window of the precinct, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The city felt like it was waiting, holding its breath, as if it knew that Derek Thompson's future as an officer was on the line. And with that, he knew that the real test was just beginning. Derek didn't sleep that night. The words from Captain Johnson echoed in his mind, louder than anything else. One last chance. It was like a drumbeat, relentless and insistent. He tried to turn off the noise, but it wouldn't go away. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was the end for him. Would he be one of the officers she decided to cut loose? Was he just another failure in her eyes? By the time morning came, Derek was exhausted, but he couldn't afford to show it. He dragged himself out of bed, threw on his uniform, and made his way to the precinct. The walk felt longer than usual, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Every step felt heavy, every breath shallow. When he arrived at the precinct, it was already bustling with activity. The usual sounds of phones ringing, officers talking, and dispatchers calling out assignments filled the air. But none of it reached Derek. He felt detached, like he was watching the world move around him from the outside, unable to fully engage. As he made his way to his desk, his eyes landed on the small stack of paperwork that awaited him. Reports, tickets, the usual administrative work. It all felt so insignificant compared to what was on the line. What mattered now wasn't the paperwork. It was proving to Captain Johnson that he could handle the pressure, that he could be the officer she needed. He sat down at his desk and forced himself to start working. But his mind kept wandering, replaying the conversation from yesterday. Prove to me that you deserve to stay in this precinct. Derek knew he couldn't just coast anymore. He couldn't take the easy way out. Every decision he made from this point forward had to count. The morning passed in a blur of mundane tasks. Derek tried to focus on the reports, but his thoughts were constantly drifting. His phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, but he ignored them. He didn't have time for distractions. Not now. He couldn't afford it. At lunchtime, Derek stepped outside for a brief break. He needed fresh air. The weight of the past few days had been suffocating, and for a moment, he just needed to breathe. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was a welcome feeling. As he walked along the sidewalk, he tried to clear his mind, focusing on the present. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what happened next. As he walked back toward the precinct, his phone rang. It was Patel. "Hey Thompson," Patel's voice came through, sounding a little more serious than usual. "You got a minute?" "Yeah, sure," Derek replied, walking back toward the doors of the precinct. "I just wanted to give you a heads up," Patel said, his voice low. "There's a big job coming up. A robbery suspect who's been on the run for a while. They think he's hiding out near the old warehouse district. I'm sure you've heard about it." Derek felt a rush of adrenaline at the mention of the case. Robbery suspects were always high stakes. If they were on the run, that meant they were dangerous. "I've heard rumors," Derek replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's the plan?" "Well," Patel said, lowering his voice even more, "they're assembling a team for the operation. You might get called in. I'm not sure yet, but I'm just giving you the heads up so you can be prepared. It's going to be a tough one." Derek's heart began to race. This was his opportunity. The kind of operation that could make or break him in the eyes of the captain. If he pulled this off, if he showed the kind of composure and skill they needed, he might finally prove to everyone that he was worthy of staying in this precinct. "Thanks for the heads up," Derek said, his voice barely containing the excitement. "I'll be ready." That afternoon, as Derek was sitting at his desk, going over case files, the call finally came. The robbery suspect had been located, and the team was assembling. His name was Tyler Hayes, a notorious criminal who had been connected to several high-profile robberies in the area. The department had been trying to catch him for months, but he was elusive, always one step ahead. This was it. Derek felt a surge of determination. He could do this. This was his chance to finally show Captain Johnson that he had what it took. The team met in the briefing room a short while later, where Sergeant Matthews outlined the plan. The old warehouse district was a maze of abandoned buildings, a perfect place for someone like Hayes to hide out. But it was also a dangerous place, filled with dark corners and narrow alleys. Derek knew this wasn't going to be easy. "All right, folks," Matthews said, standing in front of a whiteboard with a map of the area. "We've got a location, but we need to move fast. Hayes is armed, and we don't know if he's working with anyone. We'll split into teams and cover all possible exits. Thompson, you're with Patel. You two will cover the east side of the district." Derek nodded, his mind already running through the plan. He and Patel would need to move quickly, carefully. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Be careful out there," Matthews added, his voice serious. "Hayes is dangerous. Don't take any chances." As the team suited up and headed out, Derek felt the gravity of the situation settling in. This wasn't just a routine bust. This was personal. For him. For his future. The drive to the warehouse district was tense, the silence in the van oppressive. Derek's heart was pounding in his chest as he ran through the plan in his mind. He had to be careful. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything could go wrong. But as they neared the district, his resolve hardened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. When they arrived, the team quickly disembarked, moving toward their assigned positions. Derek and Patel made their way to the east side, where they would take cover behind a large metal structure. The whole area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Derek's nerves feel like they were on edge. "Stay sharp," Patel whispered, his eyes scanning the area. Hayes could be anywhere. Derek nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. He could feel his breath steadying, his focus narrowing. Every instinct told him that they were close. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the two of them crouched down behind the structure, waiting for the signal. Time seemed to stretch as they waited, the tension building with every passing second. Derek's eyes darted around, constantly checking for movement. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the abandoned buildings, making it harder to see. Then, without warning, there was a sharp sound in the distance. A gunshot. Derek's heart skipped a beat. The operation had begun. "Let's move," Patel hissed. The two of them sprinted toward the sound, adrenaline flooding Derek's veins. The feeling of urgency was like a pressure cooker, building inside him with every step. As they rounded a corner, Derek spotted movement up ahead, someone running. "Hayes!" Patel shouted, and Derek's heart skipped a beat. They were closing in on him. Without thinking, Derek and Patel gave chase, ducking behind walls and leaping over obstacles. The sound of feet pounding against the ground filled the air as they pursued Hayes through the maze of buildings. But suddenly, Derek's foot caught on a piece of debris, and he stumbled. He caught himself just in time, but when he looked up, Hayes was gone. Completely gone. "Damn it," Derek muttered under his breath. "Where'd he go?" They stopped, scanning the area. For a moment, it seemed like Hayes had vanished into thin air. But then Derek saw something, a shadow moving just ahead. "Over there," he yelled, pointing toward the figure. They ran toward it, but this time, something felt different. Derek's gut was telling him they were walking right into a trap. Just as they rounded the corner, Derek froze. Hayes was standing there, but he wasn't alone. A group of armed men, all wearing masks, stepped out from the shadows, surrounding Derek and Patel. "You're in the wrong place, officer," one of them said with a cold smile. Derek's heart raced as he realized they were not just dealing with a lone criminal. This was bigger than he had thought. And it was about to get a whole lot worse. As Hayes smirked, Derek's mind screamed, "This is it. This is where everything falls apart." The sudden realization hit Derek like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about catching a robbery suspect anymore. This was a setup. He and Patel were surrounded by a group of armed men, all wearing masks and looking far too comfortable for Derek's liking. His pulse hammered in his ears, and his fingers itched for the safety of his weapon, but he knew better than to make a move without backup. Patel's hand was already inching toward his sidearm, but Derek caught his eye and subtly shook his head. There was no point in starting a firefight now. They had no idea how many more people were waiting in the shadows. Any wrong move could lead to disaster. Well, one of the masked men said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Looks like we've got a couple of cops out for a walk. You should have stayed in your car, boys." Derek's mind raced. He needed to buy time. He needed to think. "We're not here for trouble," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "We're just looking for Hayes. No need for this to get ugly." Hayes, who had been standing quietly at the back of the group, now stepped forward, a sly grin on his face. "You think I'm just going to walk into your little trap, officer," he said, his tone mocking. "I've been running from you guys for months. You think you can just show up here and take me down?" Derek didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the group, trying to count how many men were involved. There were at least 5, maybe 6, all armed with handguns. Not the kind of odds they could handle alone. Patel's voice broke the silence. "We're not leaving without you, Hayes," he said, his voice low and filled with resolve. For a brief moment, Hayes seemed to consider Patel's words, but the tension in the air was thick, and Derek could tell that this wasn't going to end peacefully. "Well," Hayes said after a long pause, "I guess I'm not the only one making decisions here." He nodded to one of the men beside him, who immediately took a step forward, raising a handgun. Derek's stomach twisted. He had seen this situation before in training videos, but facing it in real life was different. Much different. The masked man's eyes narrowed. "We've got no business with you, cop," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you're about to become part of the plan." You're the distraction. Before Derek could process the words, a loud explosion echoed from somewhere behind them, shaking the ground beneath his feet. The force of the blast knocked him off balance, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When Derek opened his eyes again, he was on the ground, his ears ringing from the explosion. He could barely make sense of what was happening. The world felt surreal, like he was in a dream. Get up. Patel's voice cut through the haze. Derek blinked rapidly, trying to clear his head, and then he saw Patel, crouched low, pulling him by the arm. Move. Patel yelled again, urgency in his voice. We need to get out of here now. Derek's mind was spinning, but he nodded, trying to regain his footing. He was still disoriented, the ringing in his ears making it hard to think. He could see flashes of movement ahead of them, figures rushing to escape. Hayes was nowhere in sight anymore, but Derek knew that didn't mean he was safe. There was a sharp sound, a gunshot, and Derek immediately ducked, instinctively pulling Patel down with him. We need cover. Patel shouted. Head for that warehouse. Derek didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their feet and made a run for the nearest warehouse, dodging behind walls and steel beams as more gunfire echoed in the distance. As they reached the warehouse, Derek felt a sharp pain in his side. His breath hitched, and he froze for a moment, his hand instinctively reaching for the wound. Blood. It was hard to tell how serious it was, but it wasn't good. Are you hit? Patel asked, his eyes darting around, keeping an eye out for any sign of their attackers. Derek nodded. It's nothing. Keep moving. They ducked into the warehouse, the door creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, it was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of rusted metal. Derek's heart was still pounding, but the adrenaline was starting to wear off. The pain in his side felt worse now, like a steady, throbbing reminder that they were in serious trouble. We can't stay here long, Patel said, glancing around nervously. We don't know how many people are out there. Hayes could be planning something else. Derek nodded, trying to focus despite the blood dripping from his side. We have to call for backup, he said, his voice rough. We can't handle this alone. Patel's eyes flicked toward the exit, and for a moment, Derek saw the same fear in his partner's face. They were trapped. Hayes and his crew had orchestrated this brilliantly. They were dealing with something much bigger than they had anticipated, and the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Let's make the call, Patel said after a brief pause, his voice filled with resolve. We'll get out of here, but we need help. Derek pulled out his radio with trembling hands, but as he tried to key in the emergency channel, the static buzzed in his ear. Shit, Derek muttered, his heart sinking. We're too far in. Signals blocked. We're on our own then, Patel said, his voice steady despite the chaos. We can do this. Derek knew Patel was trying to be brave, but he could see the doubt in his eyes. Both of them knew how dangerous the situation was. The odds were stacked against them. Just then, a loud crash came from the back of the warehouse. Someone, or something, was moving fast. Derek's heart rate spiked. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable noise of metal scraping against concrete. Someone was coming for them. Get ready, Derek whispered, his hand gripping his weapon. The footsteps grew louder, and then suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. But it wasn't Hayes. It was Captain Johnson. Derek's eyes widened, and for a split second, he wasn't sure if he was hallucinating. What was she doing here? Had she followed them into the warehouse? The captain's eyes locked onto Derek's, and without a word, she motioned for them to stay down. Stay low, she ordered. Backup is on the way. Just hold tight. Derek couldn't believe it. Captain Johnson was here. She had somehow managed to track them down, even when they were deep inside enemy territory. But there was no time to process that now. The situation was still volatile. Derek watched as Captain Johnson moved to the front of the warehouse, scanning the surroundings with calculated precision. She had the composure of someone who had been in situations like this before, someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Stay down, both of you, she repeated, her voice a low command. We're getting out of here, but we need to move fast. Derek and Patel both nodded, though Derek couldn't help but wonder, how had Captain Johnson known where to find them? What did she know about this operation that they didn't? And more importantly, why did it feel like this was just the beginning of something much bigger? Derek crouched low as Captain Johnson scanned the warehouse, her sharp eyes darting between every shadow and crevice. Her presence was a jolt of both relief and tension. Relief because she brought with her the promise of backup. Tension because her arrival meant the situation was worse than he'd thought. Patel was the first to break the silence. "Captain, how did you find us?" She didn't look back as she answered. This whole operation was a trap. Hayes isn't just some low-level criminal. He's working with a network, one we've been tracking for months. When I heard you two were assigned here, I followed. Lucky I did. Her words hit Derek like a ton of bricks. A network? This wasn't just about a single suspect, it was a coordinated effort. He glanced at Patel, whose expression mirrored his own mix of shock and unease. "We're dealing with more than just Hayes," Captain Johnson continued, her voice low but commanding. "These men are part of a bigger operation, arms dealing, robberies, smuggling. And now, they've taken the fight to us." Derek felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about survival, about dismantling something far more dangerous than he had ever faced. Another crash echoed from deeper within the warehouse, and Derek's instincts kicked in. He gripped his sidearm tightly, ignoring the burning pain in his ribs. "They're coming," Patel whispered, his voice barely audible. Captain Johnson turned to them, her expression grim. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, don't panic. I'll get you out of this." Derek couldn't help but feel a surge of awe at her composure. She wasn't just his superior now, she was their lifeline. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the heavy thuds reverberating through the steel walls. Derek's heart pounded as he peeked around the edge of a crate. He caught a glimpse of Hayes and two of his men moving cautiously through the dimly lit space, their weapons drawn. Captain Johnson motioned for them to hold their positions. She waited, her breathing steady, her finger hovering over the trigger of her weapon. Derek marveled at how calm she was, even as danger loomed closer. Suddenly, Hayes spoke, his voice loud and mocking. "Captain Johnson, I know you're here. You think bringing backup will save these boys? You're in over your head." Derek tensed, his grip tightening on his gun. Hayes was trying to bait her, to lure them into making a mistake. Captain Johnson, however, didn't flinch. She remained still, her eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. "You know," Hayes continued, his voice echoing through the warehouse, "I almost feel bad for you. You're too predictable. Always playing by the rules. That's why you'll never win." Derek could see the faintest flicker of a smile on Captain Johnson's face. It wasn't the reaction Hayes was expecting. "If you think I play by the rules, Hayes," she said, her voice cold and sharp, "then you don't know me at all." With that, she moved. In a blur of motion, Captain Johnson shifted from their cover and fired two precise shots, the sound cracking through the warehouse. One of Hayes's men let out a cry and dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder as he fell to the ground. The other scrambled for cover, shouting a warning. Derek's heart raced as he and Patel followed her lead, stepping out just enough to provide covering fire. The warehouse erupted into chaos, gunfire ricocheting off metal walls. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and adrenaline. "Move!" Captain Johnson shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Derek and Patel stayed close as she led them toward an exit, her movements calculated and precise. She paused only to return fire, each shot driving the remaining men further back. As they neared the exit, Hayes's voice rang out again, this time filled with anger. "You think you're winning, Johnson? You've got no idea what you've stepped into." Derek's stomach churned. He didn't like the sound of that. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the ground, and Derek was thrown off his feet. Dust and debris filled the air, making it hard to see or breathe. He coughed, trying to clear his lungs, and looked around frantically. Patel was a few feet away, groaning as he pushed himself up. Captain Johnson was already on her feet, her weapon at the ready. "Are you two okay?" she barked. Derek nodded, though his ribs screamed in protest. Patel gave a shaky thumbs up. "We're fine," Patel said, his voice rough. "What the hell was that?" "They're trying to box us in," Captain Johnson said, her tone clipped. "We need to keep moving. Backup's close, but we're not out of the woods yet." Derek staggered to his feet, his vision still blurry from the blast. As the dust began to settle, he caught sight of Hayes disappearing into the shadows, his men retreating with him. "He's getting away," Derek shouted. Captain Johnson grabbed his arm, stopping him. "We're not chasing him now. Not without backup. We stick to the plan." Derek opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She was right. Charging after Hayes now would be suicide. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Derek felt a wave of relief as reinforcements arrived. Officers swarmed the warehouse, securing the perimeter and tending to the injured. The scene was chaotic, but for the first time, Derek felt like they had a fighting chance. As paramedics checked his side, Captain Johnson approached him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a spark of something in her eyes. Pride, maybe, or approval. "You did good, Thompson," she said, her voice steady. "You kept your head. That's what matters." Derek looked up at her, the weight of the day's events crashing over him. "Thanks, Captain. I didn't want to let you down." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "You didn't. But this isn't over. Hayes is still out there, and now we know he's not working alone. This is bigger than a single bust." Derek nodded, his resolve hardening. He had proven himself today, but he knew it wasn't enough. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the medics loaded one of Hayes's wounded men into an ambulance, Captain Johnson turned to Derek and Patel. "Get some rest. You'll need it. Tomorrow, we go after Hayes. For real this time." Derek's heart pounded at her words. The real fight was still ahead. And this time, he wouldn't just be fighting for redemption, he'd be fighting for justice. As the night settled over the city, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes's words still lingered in the air. "You've got no idea what you've stepped into." For the first time, Derek wondered if Hayes was right. What were they up against? And how far would they have to go to bring him down? Whatever the answer, Derek knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The morning after the explosion at the warehouse was silent, almost eerily so. Derek had barely slept, the adrenaline from the night before still coursing through his veins, and the gnawing question of what came next kept him wide-eyed in the dark. The pain in his side had dulled, but the discomfort served as a constant reminder that things had escalated far beyond anything he had ever experienced. He sat in his apartment, staring at the coffee cup in front of him, absent-mindedly swirling the contents. His mind replayed the events over and over: the ambush, Hayes's escape, and Captain Johnson's calm command. It felt like a bad dream, but it was real. And now they were in deeper than ever before. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Patel. "Patel, 9 a.m. Be there. Captain's briefing." Derek sighed and checked the time. It was already 8:30. He didn't have the luxury of avoiding the inevitable. He grabbed his jacket, slinging it over his shoulder, and headed out the door. At the precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers were moving quickly, their faces drawn and serious as they prepared for the operation that was about to unfold. Derek and Patel made their way to the briefing room, where Captain Johnson was already waiting, standing at the front of the room with a stack of files in front of her. As they entered, she didn't look up. She was deep in thought, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the stack of papers. Derek could feel the weight of the silence settle in, the room thick with anticipation. "You two are late," Captain Johnson said, not missing a beat as she finally looked up. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. "Sit down. We don't have much time." Derek and Patel took their seats, exchanging a quick glance. Patel, ever the optimist, seemed more comfortable with the tension than Derek, who could feel the unease bubbling inside him. Captain Johnson cleared her throat. "Last night was only the beginning. Hayes's crew isn't just a local gang. They're tied to something much bigger, national, even international. And it's going to take everything we've got to bring them down." Derek sat up straighter. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Captain Johnson opened the file in front of her and spread out a map. "This," she said, pointing to several marked locations across the city, "is where we've been tracking Hayes's movements. But this isn't just about him anymore. This map represents a network. Arms deals, human trafficking, smuggling. Hayes is the front. But behind him is someone bigger, a leader, an organizer. And we have no idea who they are." The room was still, the weight of her words settling in. Derek's heart raced. He had known this was going to be bigger than he first thought, but hearing it laid out like that made the reality set in with a cold jolt. Patel leaned forward. "So we don't know who's pulling the strings?" Captain Johnson shook her head. "No. But we know this much: Hayes is not our only target. We need to hit them from every angle. We've got informants, surveillance teams, and you two are going to be on the ground. You'll be going undercover." Derek blinked. "Undercover? What does that mean? Captain Johnson looked directly at him. It means you'll infiltrate their network. You'll be playing the part. I need you to get close to Hayes, to his people. Find out who's pulling the strings. And when you do, we bring the whole operation down. Derek's stomach churned. The idea of going undercover was terrifying. He wasn't cut out for pretending to be someone else, to lie and manipulate his way into the criminal underworld. But he knew there was no way around it. This was the job, and he had a responsibility to finish it. We don't have a choice, Patel said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but Derek could hear the hesitation underneath. We go undercover, we get to the core of this thing. Captain Johnson nodded. Exactly. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. This is dangerous. We don't know how deep this goes. But I trust you both to handle it. Derek swallowed hard. Trust. That word used to mean something different to him, but now as he looked at Patel and then Captain Johnson, he understood what it meant. They were all in this together. The plan was set into motion that afternoon. Derek and Patel were given false identities, aliases and backstories created by the department's undercover division. Derek was now Marcus Thompson, a small-time hustler with a history of petty theft and drug dealing. Patel was Chris Cruz, a street-level enforcer with ties to various gangs. They'd both be embedded within the lower ranks of Hayes's crew, and from there, they'd work their way up the chain. For Derek, the hardest part wasn't the danger, it was the act. The idea of pretending to be someone he wasn't, to lie and deceive in a way that felt almost unnatural to him, made his skin crawl. But the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal, it was about dismantling an entire network. He had no choice but to go through with it. That night, they met at a nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. Captain Johnson had arranged a safe house for them to stay while they worked their angles. The room was sterile with minimal furniture, but it was clean, and that was enough for now. They sat in silence for a long while. Patel was the first to speak. "So how do you feel about this?" he asked, leaning back against the wall. Derek didn't immediately respond. He was still processing everything, the plan, the danger, and the unfamiliar role he was about to step into. But he knew one thing, he couldn't back out now. Not when it mattered most. "I don't like it," Derek said finally, his voice low. "But I don't have a choice." Patel nodded. "Yeah, neither do I. But we've got each other's backs. That's all that matters." Derek forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. This wasn't the same as the academy. This wasn't the same as simple busts or taking down low-level criminals. This was war. And war meant sacrifice. The next morning, Derek and Patel were ready. They donned their new identities, walking out of the safe house like two strangers about to enter a world neither of them was prepared for. Captain Johnson had briefed them on the first target, a small-time dealer who worked under Hayes. They were to make contact with him and get close enough to find out who his connections were. This would be their first test. Derek felt the weight of his new persona press down on him. As they approached the designated meeting spot, his nerves spiked. He glanced at Patel, who seemed calm but just as alert. "This is it," Patel said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's make it count." Derek nodded, swallowing his fear. The game had begun. As they reached the alley where they were supposed to meet the contact, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet, too empty. Then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, reaching for his weapon, but before he could react, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You boys don't look like you belong here." Derek froze. It was him, Hayes. The last thing Derek expected was for Hayes to find them this soon. Hayes's eyes gleamed with malice. "You really think you can play me, Thompson?" Derek's breath caught in his throat. Hayes knew. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a setup. And suddenly, the game wasn't just about taking down a criminal network. It was about survival. Derek's heart pounded as Hayes's voice echoed through the alley. The realization hit him like a freight train. They'd been made. This wasn't just a test of their undercover skills anymore. This was a life-or-death situation. Hayes's crew had sniffed them out, and now they were cornered. Patel shifted slightly beside him, his body tense but his face calm. Derek could see the subtle movement of his hand inching toward the concealed weapon in his waistband. But the odds were stacked against them. Hayes wasn't alone. Several of his men emerged from the shadows, guns drawn, their faces filled with cold calculation. "You really thought you could walk into my world without me noticing?" Hayes continued, his tone smug. He gestured lazily toward Derek and Patel. "Drop the act. Who sent you?" Derek forced himself to stay calm, even as every instinct screamed at him to run or fight. He glanced at Patel, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. They needed to stall, to buy time. Backup couldn't be far. "Look, Hayes," Derek said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "We're just here to talk. No need for this to get messy." Hayes let out a low, humorless laugh. "Talk? Is that what you call it? No, see, I don't do talking with people who lie to me. I do teaching. And you're about to learn a lesson you won't forget." The tension thickened as Hayes motioned for his men to close in. Derek's pulse raced, his mind scrambling for a way out. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and backup wasn't here yet. He needed to act. Patel stepped forward, raising his hands slowly. "All right, Hayes. You've got us. But think about this. If you kill 2 cops, how long do you think it'll take before this whole city comes crashing down on you?" Hayes paused, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Derek thought Patel's gamble might actually work. But then Hayes smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Who said I was going to kill you?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "There are worse things than dying, officer." Before Derek could respond, Hayes's men grabbed him and Patel, forcing them to their knees. The cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against the back of Derek's head, and he felt a wave of fear unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This was it. They were out of options. But then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens cut through the silence. Hayes froze, his smirk fading. Derek felt a flicker of hope. Backup was coming. "Boss, we've got company," one of Hayes's men said, his voice tense. Hayes's jaw clenched, and he looked between Derek and Patel, his expression a mix of anger and calculation. "This isn't over," he hissed. He motioned for his men to retreat, disappearing into the shadows as the sound of sirens grew louder. Derek let out a shaky breath as the pressure of the gun barrel disappeared. He and Patel scrambled to their feet just as squad cars screeched to a stop at the mouth of the alley. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, securing the area. Captain Johnson was the last to arrive, her expression unreadable as she strode toward them. Derek braced himself for the storm. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded, her voice cold. "We were set up," Derek said, his voice still shaking. "Hayes knew we were coming." Captain Johnson's eyes narrowed. "And you walked right into it?" Derek opened his mouth to defend himself, but she held up a hand. "Save it. We'll debrief later. Right now, we've got bigger problems. Hayes and his crew are moving fast. They're not just running, they're setting up for something big." Patel frowned. "Bigger than what we've seen so far?" Johnson nodded grimly. "We intercepted some communications earlier. Hayes isn't just a middleman, he's planning a massive arms deal. And if we don't stop it, we're looking at a bloodbath." Derek felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. They weren't just chasing a criminal anymore, they were racing against time to prevent a catastrophe. The team regrouped at the precinct, where Captain Johnson laid out the details of the impending operation. Hayes's arms deal was set to go down at an abandoned shipping yard on the outskirts of the city. The location was sprawling and difficult to secure, making it the perfect place for Hayes to operate. "This is our shot," Johnson said, her voice steady but urgent. "We take him down here, or we risk losing him for good." The room was quiet, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Derek glanced at Patel, who gave him a reassuring nod. They were in this together, no matter what. That night, the team moved in. The shipping yard was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the soft rustle of the wind. Derek's heart raced as he and Patel took their positions, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Through his earpiece, he heard Captain Johnson's voice. "Team Alpha, report." "All clear," Derek whispered. "Hold position. Wait for my signal." The minutes felt like hours as they waited, tension crackling in the air. Then, movement. Derek spotted Hayes and his crew near a row of shipping containers, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. Beside them were several large crates, undoubtedly filled with illegal arms. "Target in sight," Derek whispered. "Wait for my signal," Johnson repeated. But Hayes wasn't waiting. He turned, barking orders at his men. One of them moved toward the crates, opening a lid to reveal an arsenal of high-powered rifles. Derek's breath hitched. They couldn't wait any longer. "Captain, they're moving the weapons," he said urgently. "Move in," Johnson commanded. Chaos erupted. Officers stormed the yard, shouting orders as Hayes's men scattered. Gunfire rang out, and Derek found himself ducking behind a container, returning fire as Hayes's crew fought back. Through the chaos, Derek spotted Hayes slipping away, darting between containers toward a waiting vehicle. "He's escaping," Derek shouted, breaking cover to chase after him. "Thompson, fall back." Johnson's voice barked through his earpiece, but Derek didn't stop. He couldn't let Hayes get away. He sprinted after the fleeing suspect, his breath ragged, his side burning with pain. Hayes reached the vehicle and climbed in, but before he could start the engine, Derek caught up, yanking the door open and dragging him out. The two men grappled, Hayes throwing wild punches as Derek fought to subdue him. Finally, with one last surge of strength, Derek slammed Hayes against the car, pinning him. "It's over," Derek shouted, his voice hoarse. Hayes struggled, but the fight had left him. Officers swarmed in, cuffing him and pulling him away. As the dust settled, Derek stood in the center of the yard, his chest heaving. The operation was over. Hayes was in custody, and the weapons had been secured, but the victory felt hollow. Derek knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Captain Johnson approached, her expression unreadable. "You disobeyed a direct order," she said quietly. "I couldn't let him escape," Derek replied, meeting her gaze. She studied him for a moment before nodding. "You did good tonight, Thompson. But don't make a habit of going rogue." "Understood." "Yes, ma'am," Derek said, relief washing over him. As Hayes was loaded into a squad car, Derek felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. They had won this round, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Captain Johnson's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Go home, Thompson. Rest. Tomorrow, we figure out what's next." Derek nodded, watching as the convoy of vehicles disappeared into the night. He had proven himself today, but he knew the road ahead would be even harder. And as he walked back toward his car, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the officer he was meant to be.